My fidelity is to the truth, that means documented evidentiary material, historical processes, where the truth makes a difference, where it's important, where it's dealing with an issue that we need to confront. That's important to confront, that will take society farther. Not gotcha journalism, not exposing picadillos, but if it makes somebody madder than hell, but it's important enough, too bad.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today's guest is Fairbanks author Dan O'Neill. Over the past 45 years, Dan has published editorials and op-eds in all of Alaska's major newspapers. And from 1998 to 2002, he had a bi-weekly column in the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner. He has compiled the best of those pieces into his most recent book, The Impertinent Question: The Words and Adventures of a Liberal Columnist at a Conservative Newspaper in the Red State of Alaska. Today, we are talking about that book. He is also the author of the Firecracker Boys, A Land Gone Lonesome, The Last Giant of Beringia, and Stubborn Gal. Dan O'Neill, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me again, Andrew.
We're going to talk about your latest book, The Impertinent Question, which just came out this year. I guess talk about the birth of this book.
Okay, so I had a newspaper column in the Fairbanks paper for some years, and my portfolio was to be kind of a voice of the progressive left in a conservative paper, a conservative town. And so it was always a bit of a battle, but lots of fun. And eventually, I think I just rubbed enough influential people the wrong way that they let me go. And it was kind of a joke. At first, the reasoning was that it cost too much money, but they paid me $50 a column. I was just too much of an agitator.
Well, it's interesting because in Firecracker Boys, your first book, you talked a lot about the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner being basically a voice of industry, a voice of the military-industrial complex. I guess what I'm trying to say is that you hadn't been very nice to the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner in that book, which was very popular. So I don't know if they had any hesitation about bringing you on as a columnist in the beginning.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, at the time, the editorial page editor was a fellow named Sam Bishop. And Sam was a decent guy, a fair-minded guy. And I would just get cyclically furious with the paper for the bias of its coverage. And it was a generational thing, generation after generation, for many decades. That paper was essentially an organ of the Republican Party. I gave an hour-long talk a couple years ago entitled The Chronic Bias of the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner, and I went wall-to-wall for an hour with nothing but examples of really outrageous bias in journalism, both on the reporting side, which is a mortal sin, but on the editorial side too, which is just simply unfair. And so at one point, it was a Bill Clinton State of the Union talk, and Bill Clinton was presiding over the first balanced budget in 30 years, a booming economy. He related that success with his policies in his State of the Union speech. That was the story of that day. You couldn't find it in the Fairbanks paper. They did not run one story that covered that speech. It only covered Republican reaction to the speech, led by, of course, our three pit bull Republican Congress people who didn't even attend, but sneered and slandered.
So it would have been Frank Murkowski, Ted Stevens, and Don Young.
Right. And so I just thought, you can't find that in a single other newspaper of any repute. And so I wrote Sam this big, long, I don't know, maybe 3-4 single-space pages outlining their chronic bias. And how is that, newspapers enjoy special protection under the U.S. Constitution. The freedom of the press is enumerated among all industries. I think it's the only one that says, hey, we have to protect this industry, private industry, because it's important to the functioning of a democracy. If we can't have educated electorate, we're going to lose this thing. And so they have special protections. So there's incumbent upon them an expectation that they provide a range of voices to debate public issues. What's wrong with that? In conservative media, and it's just as true today as it was when I got incensed in 1998, this is being lost. I laid it out, and Sam thought that a reasonable argument and took it to the editorial board of the Fairbanks paper. And I gather there was some resistance to it because I said there to Sam, I said, I want to criticize the paper too from time to time. And he told them that, and they didn't like that. But as he told me, he said, well, none of my other columnists have any particular proscriptions. They go write about what they want to write about. And he got it through. That's my understanding. And he and I got along fine. From my perspective, I'm sure I caused him a lot of trouble, a lot of heartache, but he was very decent to me. He wouldn't change a comma without calling me up. And if he had a question about whether I was saying more than the data supported, the evidence supported, he'd tell me, we'd talk it through. And I welcomed that because, I'm fallible too. Everybody needs an editor.
So the book includes columns that definitely come from after that 4-year period. So you continue to be an occasional, I guess, op-ed not getting paid for.
Correct. And that's in the Daily News and the Empire and here and there. I continue to do that kind of thing. And I did op-eds also before the column too. So I kind of, harvested what I thought was the best from about 40 years worth. So the original question was, how the heck did you get to do this anyway? And it was kind of that I thought, on the one hand, I put in a lot of work on these things, and they appear for a day and then they're fish wrap. And that was one thing. And another was just that so many of them related to issues we still face, and that the intellectual work I did sorting the problem out is still worth going through today with respect to many of our issues. And so I thought, this is still pertinent. This still deserves to be read.
The pieces do feel very relevant today. They don't feel dated. The pieces that aren't relevant today are illuminating parts of the history that I didn't know, that's important for me to know. You take aim at a lot of sacred calves, so to speak. You go after the military-industrial complex wholeheartedly multiple times. And I think particularly today, given Senator Dan Sullivan's work to increase military spending in Alaska, I think that's very relevant. But you don't just go after that. You go after some others. You go after the Iditarod, which I'll just say no one goes after the Iditarod. In fact, maybe that's where I'll start. I will have you just read this particular story about when you watch the Iditarod. I don't know exactly which year it is.
Yeah, that's got to be early 80s.
Early 80s. I'm going to have you just read this one paragraph from what you observed watching the Iditarod.
Which did you pick?
I picked it right here.
Yeah. Okay. The year I watched the race, a front runner panicked when he thought he was falling behind. He lost his temper with a dog that was too exhausted to eat. He shouted at the dog that if he didn't start eating, he would shove the food down his throat. And then he did just that. He wrenched open the dog's mouth and slammed the food in. This was not a composed and considered, quote, force feeding. It was done angrily and brutally. The musher went on to finish extremely high in the standings and receive an award for having taken, quote, outstanding care of his dog team. So yeah, my wife and I ran our 2 dog teams from Nenana to Nome. And when we got to White Mountain, there's a mandatory layover there of, I don't know if it was 4 or 8 hours in those days. When we got to White Mountain, we said, let's just stay here and let all the front runners go through because I don't want any tangles with these people because they were getting crazy. So we watched that scene on video. There was a camera crew taking pictures. So I think it had happened in Koyuk, actually. And I remember saying to the guys, are you going to put that in your newscast? And of course they weren't. And, like, well, how do you think that will affect the race? And I thought, well, maybe in a healthy way. That's my thought. So anyway, of course, they didn't show it. And but it left a lasting impression on me. And the top teams dragged their teams out of that village. I don't know if I wrote that in there.
You did.
They picked up the gang line at the front of the team, and they forced those poor dogs to their feet. They start by standing every dog up. By the time they got to the leaders, the wheelers had sat down already, laid down. And then they go back and do it again. And then finally they just dragged them out. And these are top teams, top names. Everybody knows them. And I thought, this is atrocious. Give me a break. Here, my dogs are popping their harness ready to go. And they've come, they will have gone 800 miles. The difference was sleeping. And then the other picture that is indelible in my mind is as every dog is laying there for their rest, just completely horizontal, legs out straight, and around the nose of each dog was a cube of butter, half a pound of bacon, a package of cream cheese, all this expensive people food within inches of each of their noses, and not one of them twitched to eat. So, sorry, that doesn't work. And I was a dog musher. I like dog mushing, but this wasn't selling for me. So I wrote, I think that was the very first op-ed I ever wrote, was on that. And at the time, the Yukon Quest was starting up. And there was a fellow named Leo Olson who was running that race. Really good guy, he's gone now. And he, without even telling me, he reprinted that op-ed from the Daily News-Miner and put it in the packet of every applicant for the Yukon Quest. Said, read it and weep, boys. Figure this out. We're not going to be that way. So I thought that was cool. It had an effect. I don't know if it had any effect on the Iditarod.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask, do you think it's better now? They have longer breaks, required breaks.
You'd almost have to be out there to see, because the way the presentation is cold. It's sanitized.
Well, hey, I might not have the courage to leave this in, but the reason why I was particularly impressed with that is it might have been 2024 where 3 dogs died, and I had a special order where I said the dogs' names. And my dad was a dog person, and so I was kind of like paying a tribute to my dad and him loving dogs more than people, and talking about these 3 dogs who died. And I ran it by maybe 3 of my colleagues, and they were like, "Oh my God, you cannot say, like, are you crazy? You cannot go to the House floor and talk about dogs dying in the Iditarod. Like you misunderstand this entire state, Andrew. What is wrong with you?" And I didn't do it, but I've always kind of had that feeling of like, that running a dog to death is not okay.
What you're getting at really is, it reminds me of a question I got the other day from an interviewer in Palmer, but the thrust of it's not the way he formulated it at all, but the thrust of it was, how is it so easy for you to be not nice to people? Something like that. And I had a hard time with the question because I realized it's not something I think about. I really don't think about it much. My fidelity is to the truth, that means documented evidentiary material, historical processes, where the truth makes a difference, where it's important, where it's dealing with an issue that we need to confront. That's important to confront, that will take society farther. Not gotcha journalism, not exposing picadillos, but if it makes somebody madder than hell, but it's important enough, too bad.
I want to talk about the military issue, because I would say in particular, folks who haven't served in the military, and I'm talking about elected officials, they will bend over backwards to praise the military no matter what, because being labeled anti-military in Alaska is a suicide mission. You just cannot do that. As a politician, you cannot do that. The military is deserving of criticism, and sometimes they don't get it. So I appreciate that so many of these columns are offering the criticism that is otherwise absent. I feel like I do have to say that you're not perfect. I took offense. There is one of your columns where you talk about the lack of training in the National Guard as being a real problem. And you talk about the scandal of Abu Ghraib. And I will just say, as somebody who served in the National Guard and knows the data and the studies, National Guard units tend to outperform the active duty units in many respects. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to stand up for my own people and say that I don't think that it's fair. That criticism I felt was unfair. Now, I got that off my chest.
Okay, but I got to say that, as I recall, I said a lack of training contributed to the grotesque abuses of Abu Ghraib. I don't recall that I said lack of training by National Guard.
You didn't, but the fact that you talk about the National Guard in such close proximity to that paragraph made me uncomfortable.
Okay.
So really it might, you're not specifically saying that National Guard troops are responsible, but the fact that you talk about so many of these folks in Iraq being National Guard units who have less training, and then talking about Abu Ghraib.
And I would love the chance to revisit that and make sure that the language doesn't make that association, because I never meant to make that association because I didn't know if that was so at all. I assumed it was regular troops who were administering Abu Ghraib. But what I was saying is that when you're training, 2 weekends a month and 2 weeks a year, you don't have the training of a regular troop. And so you are more likely to come home in a body bag. And that was something I had read. And that's what I wanted to say about what was going on there, that it was in the context of closing bases that were
Well, it's
obsolete.
complicated, because I would say if you were deployed to the front lines, you were more likely to come home in a body bag. Who was getting sent to the front lines? I mean, I'd be curious to see, because I know many Guard units that were sent to the front line. And so them being sent home in body bags could be directly attributable to the area of action to which they were being forced to serve.
Fair enough.
And not necessarily about their training. And obviously I'm a physician assistant. I served in the National Guard as a medical provider. What I can tell you is that medical providers who spend most of their time working in the community see a vast greater degree of disease and injury than the typical active duty medical provider who's treating 25-year-olds with sprained ankles. And so from a medical perspective, being a National Guard member meant that you were ready in a way that someone who had been on a base treating healthy young men, for the most part, wasn't ready for.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree that it's complicated. Mm. Yeah. The point where what I was doing there was that you would find all these gung-ho military supporters resisting closing an obsolete base, a base the Pentagon said we don't need and it's expensive.
Eielson, for example.
At a time when our troops were ill-equipped in Iraq and they were dying. And so the money ought to have been spent to train troops if we were going to be in this goofy war to begin with.
Well, and that was BRAC.
Base Realignment and Closure Committee, something like that.
So I'm glad you brought that up. I am the co-chair of the Joint Armed Services Committee, and we have a committee meeting happening in Fairbanks at the end of this month because we're going to rewrite the statute. The statute that established the Joint Armed Services Committee, JASC, was written at the time of BRAC. And almost every aspect of the statute is about how this committee will help facilitate BRAC. And so the statute doesn't make sense in 2025 because those base closures did not happen. And so I think the committee has in large part been sort of a ceremonial committee where generals can sit down and say they're communicating with the legislature and get some photo ops. Obviously, I would like for a more meaningful committee. So I want to rewrite those statutes and update them. But I think that the arguments that you make in your columns about Eielson in particular, all of these arguments that are made by the federal delegation at the time, and I would say probably the federal delegation today, about Alaska's strategic location, about Eielson's strategic location, well, Elmendorf
Right.
fits the exact same bill, and having two very similar Air Force bases in close proximity probably isn't the best use of resources.
It's redundant and hugely expensive. It's a boondoggle. And like I quoted that column, Colonel Hackworth, who was a columnist and very outspoken supporter of the military, most particularly training of troops. And so I didn't have to make the most forceful parts of my argument. He made them for me, and I just quoted them. And he said, really, who are the most outrageous abuser of this phenomenon of retaining unneeded bases? Our senators in our state, Ted Stevens and Frank Murkowski, fighting to keep places like Eielson open when they were a tenth the size of Fort Bragg, but cost as much.
Right. Well, and I mean, it's very relevant since Senator Sullivan wants to reopen ADAC and make it a Navy base.
It's like 1,000 miles from mainland Alaska, which is already 1,000 miles west of, at that point, the West Coast. So it's way out there, all right. Yeah, I mean, it becomes kind of transparent that it's about bringing federal dollars to the state to get votes to get reelected to keep your office.
Right. Well, full disclosure, Senator Dan Sullivan had a meeting with legislators just recently, a couple of weeks ago, and I asked the question, with these hundreds of millions of dollars that will be coming into the state for defense, how much can we creatively divert to building new housing in our communities? And I said, and how creative can we get to building new housing all over Alaska, not just in direct proximity to the bases? Because we all know that we need more housing and that it's very expensive. And if there's some way that we can leverage some of this money to get more materials, building materials, etc., into these communities that need it, that's something that we could do. And so it's me thinking like, okay, well, they found this politically favorable way of directing hundreds of millions of dollars here. Let's see if we can use those hundreds of millions of dollars in a way that's actually helpful to the community.
Yeah. Consistent with a reasonable regard for the rest of the country. I can see the opportunism that you're describing as maybe being something that's worth pursuing, but so often it comes at the expense of others in our nation. At witness Lisa Murkowski's big, beautiful bill vote, she brought crumbs back to Alaska, and the rationale is, I made the best deal for Alaskans. I don't know, do you have family members outside and that are going to be affected? I do. Grandchildren, a mentally ill brother of 73 years of age, and then 3 granddaughters with the Obamacare program. And, I mean, all of us are interrelated to people beyond our border here. And it's not an ethical or moral rationale to make Alaskans marginally better off when the cost is horrific to tens of millions of people in our country. Sorry, no sale.
Another aspect of looking at the military is their effects on the environment. I'm going to have you read just 3 paragraphs from your column called Alaska, Bombing Range of the Free World. And I think it's pretty powerful 3 paragraphs right there.
Okie doke. What would you say if the military proposed to shoot 3,500 rockets packed with high explosives into a drainage of the Chena River upstream of town and the state recreation area? What would you say if at the same location they also wanted to drop 4,300 bombs, each weighing up to a ton? And on top of that, shoot off 50,000 additional high explosives. Would you wonder if these munitions can contaminate the soil? They can. Would you ask if the contamination can spread to surface water and groundwater? It can. Would you be concerned that unexploded rockets and bombs might lie undetected in the brush or burrowed into the soil? Inevitably, that happens. The fact is, the bombing statistics quoted above are not what the military is proposing to do. It is what the military already has done in just 5 years at the Stewart Creek impact area, which includes the South Fork of the Chena River. A similar list of bombs and rockets and missiles have been shot into the countryside along the Delta River adjacent to Fort Greely in the last few years, according to a draft legislative environmental impact statement just released by the Army.
I think it's important that we talk about that. I mean, you have other columns talking about the nerve gas issue, about contamination from lots and lots of training happening on our bases, and that training often spilling outside the boundaries of the base itself.
Yeah. Or even if it didn't, it converts Alaska wilderness to a permanent no man's land. They can't fight fires in there because they're the certainty of unexploded ordnance. So all those fires grow and grow. Some will smolder under the snow through the winter and reignite when the conditions are right the next summer. And so sometimes Fairbanks is totally smoked out for weeks at a time, really, really unhealthy air because we can't fight fires in the Tanana Flats. But the idea that we would turn over our wonderful wilderness countryside to the whole free world, to invite all these other nations, too smart to bomb their own country, to come over here and we sell our birthright for what? Some motel rooms and restaurant receipts and whatever. It just floors me. I just think it's atrocious.
You write about the Scud missiles and about, through skillful journalistic research and questioning, being able to discover the types of missiles that were being used in a certain test and reporting on it. And it's implied in the book that this is actually what got you terminated at the Daily News-Miner.
Yeah. The official explanations were rotating and internally inconsistent and implausible. What is known is that in close proximity to me blowing the whistle on what kind of missiles were to be secretly launched near Fairbanks is that they lost a lot of military spending because once the whistle was blown, the military canceled the projects. And then I lost my column. And there was a back and forth between me and the editor.
Yeah, the editor was connected with the military. I don't remember it, but
she was the spouse of an active duty fellow based on Wainwright at the time. And she was brand new to Alaska and brand new to the job of being editorial page editor. And anyway, I had gotten interested in this launch out of Poker Flat Rocket Range, which is part of UAF, that was classified, and they wouldn't say what kind of missile they were going to launch, but they were going to evacuate all the people who lived nearby Poker Flat, which is north of Fairbanks, 20 miles or so. And so anyway, I started digging into it, and I figured it out that it was going to be Scud missiles, so a Soviet bloc missile that was famously erratic in the Iraq War. That broke up in flight, and they had a really nasty oxidizer called inhibited red fuming nitric acid. And
if you got, it would burn your skin really badly. If you got it on you. And
could kill you. There's lots of different ways it can really mess you up. And they were going to crash unburned IRFNA, as they called it, into the Brooks Range. And there was going to be up to 20 missiles. And there was no discussion of this, most particularly at the UAF Faculty Senate, because heretofore we hadn't done classified military weapons research. Some classified, yes, some military, yes, but never all of those, which is typically the province of a testing range, a military testing range.
Right.
We were the only rocket range affiliated with the university. So that was a first. And then many universities did do classified military work, and many did not, refused to. But in any case, isn't that a discussion for your faculty senate? It seemed specifically at odds with the mission statement of the University of Alaska, which talks about finding knowledge and propagating it. You propagate it through instruction, publication, and so on. And here you had something that was about the sequestration of knowledge. Yeah, we'll get this knowledge, but we won't share it. And our students can't be involved because they don't have clearance. And stuff like this was anathema to the way a university runs. So I didn't necessarily think the crashing of these rockets into the Brooks Range was an environmental disaster. Maybe it wasn't. What I did know was that this should be talked about at the university without it being pushed through by the militarists there, who were basically giving their Auroral Research Rocket Range over to the military for money. That's what was going on. So fine, you want to do that? Let's talk about it. Let's argue about it. See if it fits our mission or not. Don't sneak this thing through. So that's why I spent 2 weeks on that column, 2 full-time weeks, sussing out that it was Scud missiles. I ran it by arms control experts at MIT, 2 there and 1 somewhere else. And all 3 agreed that I had found Scud, that's Scud B. And so I thought it was really interesting. And then I tried to get the editor to give me a side-by-side, 2 columns, one day, one the next day. And she said, no. I tried to get 1,000 words instead of 750. She said, no. I said, could we have it on a Sunday with the most readership? She said, no. I said, can I at least put a graphic alongside the thing? She said, no. So I said, rude gesture. And I took it to the Anchorage Daily News and served it up to them on the silverest of platters. And they sent up their ace investigative guy. And I sat him down in my cabin and spread out all my files. And then he contacted the rocket range, and at that point, the jig was up. And the military canceled. And then basically at the same time, then the Daily News did their spread. And, I couldn't get even an extra few words. They put it, banner headline, color photos on the front page, big story on the front page. Jump page was full of color photos and graphics. And I think there was even yet another page. So they gave it the amount of ink and attention and prominence that the story deserved, obviously, that I couldn't get any of. But that torqued the editor quite a bit. She called me up once she saw the Daily News spread and basically said my days were numbered. And so
I think what's important about this story is it shows I'm in the middle of doing a series on Alaska media, the state of Alaska's media. And this is an example where shining a light on something changes the history. These Scud missiles weren't launched. This program was canceled because you dug into it. When you couldn't get the word out, you found a way to get the word out. And having the light shown on the project itself killed the project. And we talked a lot about the reduction in the number of journalists working in Alaska and how that means there's being less light shown around, and therefore probably some very important stories that should have been covered haven't been covered, and probably some projects that shouldn't be going forward because no one's looking.
Yeah. Well, you're doing a really good job, Andrew. I listened to your Pat Doherty and Tom Hewitt interviews, and I see you have Ryan Binkley, and I'm going to listen to that next. And that's really important because they're very thoroughgoing discussions that give you the history by the guys who were involved in the history.
I want to conclude with talking a little bit about the fact that although you were, as it says in your subtitle, liberal columnist at a conservative newspaper in the red state of Alaska, you may have been a liberal columnist, but that doesn't mean that you pulled your punches from quote unquote liberals. I want to talk very briefly about Point Hope and the story that there had been some radioactive material that was stored near Point Hope, but 30 years later, that small amount of radioactive material not really being an environmental hazard to the village of Point Hope, but the Daily News sort of doing a splashy, controversial story that got national attention, maybe international attention.
Yep, I did.
And that being, I'm sure that the current media environment and its dependence on social media and getting hits our current environment is that same environment on steroids. This was a story that sold a lot of newspapers, and therefore it ran, even though it was ultimately causing a lot of stress and harm to Point Hope.
It's terrible, yeah. Okay, to be as brief as I can, when I was researching the book, The Firecracker Boys, I found in the archives of the Lawrence Livermore National Weapons Laboratory a document that showed that radionuclides were brought to Oglethorpe Creek near Point Hope, 30 miles from Point Hope, used in a specific experiment, and then were not disposed of according to regulation, but rather heaped into a mound with dirt pressed up by bulldozers to cover it over. They couldn't really dig a pit in the permafrost, so that's how they buried it. And that it was wildly out of spec for how you were supposed to bury radionuclides of that type. And so I took it to scientists I trusted, familiar with radiation science, and they told me not to worry. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to worry, but it was illegal what they did and by their own regulations. And they never told the native people about it who lived nearby, who typically did dig in mounds for artifacts, for Christ's sake. So anyway, I thought I'd cover it in the book. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, it's going to take me a year or more to get this book done. I should tell the people now, just because it shouldn't be something I hold on to. So I did share my documents with a guy from Point Hope who had been interested in my work. And then I shared it with a guy who was tracking military toxics in Alaska. And I cautioned them that, I understand this is not any kind of hazard, and I will deal with it in the book. But just so you know, because I thought even a native person might file a land claims on that spot because the military put in an airstrip and there were still some James Way huts there. In fact, that had happened. So all of a sudden, some random guy might own a nuclear waste dump, you see. So it was something I needed to disclose earlier rather than later. Well, anyway, the guy from Point Hope went completely nuts with the deal and started proceedings claiming genocide at the UN. And so it was completely overwrought and unsupported by science. But then it started to run away. So then the Daily News got a hold of it, came to me, and I said, I encouraged them not to run a story because it would excite so much fear, especially in the older native people up there. And it really, there was no there. Scientifically, this was not a medical hazard to
People weren't going to get cancer from living 30 miles from this small amount of radionucleotide stored in this way.
You'd have to eat it. You'd have to dig it up and eat it. That's it. I'm not a scientist in this area. It's not my area of expertise. However, that's my understanding. So anyway, they did run a splashy story, and it was picked up everywhere, McClatchy chain. But then it led the national section of the New York Times on a Sunday, and an LA Times had a big story. People saw it overseas, and it was too delicious a story, the idea that virtually Stone Age man confronts nuclear nightmare underneath their ancient village and stuff like that, the way it was hyped. And so then I tried to put the record straight on all that in my book, but it's undergone a resurgence from the same guy I gave it to in Point Hope, has periodically made outlandish claims, one of which is that the bombs to explode for Project Chariot, which I guess I should say was a plan to create an instant harbor near Point Hope at Oglethorpe Creek near Cape Thompson by burying and detonating nuclear bombs. Didn't happen. It didn't get off the ground at all, but it was studied for some years. Well, anyway, this guy makes the claim that the bombs were brought to Alaska and the drill holes were drilled and the bombs were and are in place now, and that they're perhaps leaking and causing cancers and all.
But none of that's true.
None of that's true. The boreholes he's seen were for thermistor cables, which is something that helps you to detect ground temperature at depth. And they're not aligned the way you would to excavate a harbor. They're randomly located at different geological kind of places, so you could get data on the rocks and at the beach and in the mud flats and stuff like that, just as they are known to be. And the boreholes are too small to contain a nuclear device of that era, period. There's no way that you could bring bombs up there without an enormous security blanket being thrown over the whole Northwest Arctic. Didn't happen. Native people were at the camp. Critics of Chariot, white scientists, were at the camp. Nobody heard any kind of evidence of anything like this. It's absurd on its face. And yet it keeps getting brought up, and it keeps terrifying the people. And an awful lot of people out there believe that the cancers they see are caused by what's buried by the Atomic Energy Commission.
Well, I appreciate that. And I guess the reason I bring it up is that you're not just trying to find the most outlandish story to be on the front page of the New York Times. In this case, you were trying to stop the story from going on the front of the front page of the New York Times.
Yep, I'm an equal opportunity attack dog. I mean, I honestly do think that I'm not trying to sell progressive political agenda. I'm trying to expose things that are unjust, socially unjust. I'm trying to correct a historical record that's wrong. Those are the things that drive me. And I have plenty of opportunity to shoot at the left in this regard, too. In fact, people who know me best know I could go on and on about that.
Okay, well, I want to close by having you do a 3-paragraph reading from Overseas Meddling in Elections. I believe that this is, I guess, going after the left in some way. And, it just opened my mind.
Okay. Now, I would never have guessed you to pick that one, but good. Okay. One issue dogging President Clinton as he travels in China is the question of whether his last presidential campaign accepted large cash donations that originated with the Chinese government. Republicans in the Congress call the episode a scandal with profound implications. And if it's proved, I'd have to agree with them. Strikes me as an aggressive act for one country to attempt to secretly to influence the processes of democracy in another country. But I wonder if Newt and Trent and the boys have any idea how the rest of the world must be laughing at their self-righteous posturing. It's an expression, I believe, of what historian Paul Boyer has called, quote, the power and the tendency of the myth of American innocence, the belief that we are somehow set apart from other nations of the world, our motives higher, our methods purer, end quote. Meddling in foreign elections? The United States is past master of this art. Just 2 years ago, U.S. politicos and their media boosters were congratulating themselves for swaying the Russian elections toward favored candidate Boris Yeltsin. Quote, Yanks to the rescue, shouted the cover of Time magazine. The writers of the 10-page story about the American political operatives who, quote, clandestinely participated in guiding Yeltsin's campaign, end quote, neglected at any point to wonder if this sort of intervention in the elections of another country was proper.
And you go on to talk about our interventions in many other elections. Right. And it's such important context. And the thing is that, I watched national media around the time of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election in the United States. And there were people who would mention, well, it's a little bit hypocritical for America to be making these claims because, of course, we do it. But it went right over my head. I wasn't really thinking, did we really? Not to this extent, but actually to every extent.
Oh, yeah, we overthrew governments.
We overthrow governments. Yeah. And sometimes
democratically elected.
Yes, and sometimes, I was going to point that out. In South America, overthrowing democratically elected governments in exchange for brutal dictatorships.
That happened. That's history.
Dan O'Neill, thank you so much for publishing The Impertinent Question. Thank you so much for being on the podcast again. This is your 4th appearance on the podcast, which makes you the most interviewed guest I've ever had. And I'll say this up front. You have the most downloaded, most popular episode that I've ever had. And it was about Land Gone Lonesome, our first interview.
What are we doing? The
destruction of subsistence lifestyle in the upper Yukon River. It's really hard for me to explain because when I look at my top 10 episodes, some of them are controversial, but that one, I'm very glad that it's the most popular episode. I love that episode, but it's sort of a niche target audience.
Yeah. And I don't think it's been all that popular sales-wise, unfortunately. I like the book, but that's good. I'm glad there's that interest.
For listeners out there, Land Gone Lonesome is an amazing book. And It's funny because I think that it influenced me. I'm sure I did that interview with you before I was a legislator. It has informed everything that I think about fish. I think about fish on the upper Yukon before I think about coastal communities. And that's, I think, an unusual perspective. So it's changed me.
I'm glad to hear that because you're right. I mean, when fish is talked about in Alaska, halls of power anyway, it's coastal fishing. And yet the devastation that's happened now along the interior rivers for lack of king salmon and now chum, it's just heartbreaking. There are many dozens, scores of villages that have relied for 10,000 years on this really iconic fish run, the Yukon River Kings and the Cusco Kings. And now there is no fishing. I just came back from the Yukon a couple of days ago where my wife Sarah's brother, Charlie Campbell, has a fish camp above the village of Tanana, a place called the Rapids. And he's been fishing there for, I don't know, decades, along with a lot of other guys. And now there is nothing. I mean, you see the tin falling off of these smokehouses, and some fish camps you can't even find anymore. They're so grown up as you go by on a boat. And there's a native lady saying, you used to sit out in the evening and see all the fires just downriver from all the fish camps, and now there is nothing. It's really, really sad. And it's not just a food source. It's a whole key ingredient in their culture. And all of that comes crashing down without the fish. It's really a shame.
It's a great book, and I recommend it.
Thanks. And thanks for having me again, Andrew. You're doing great work, both in the legislature and with this important podcast.
Thank you so much.
I've dropped links in the show notes to Dan's previous appearances on this podcast. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.